Welcome back to Bizarre Books, the channel where I narrate the books that no one else will. Viewer discretion strongly advised.
The Gates of Janus by Brady. Chapter 7. The desire of the moth for the star, of the night for the morrow, the devotion to something afar, from the sphere of our sorrow. Shelley, 1792 to 1822. As I shall be examining the cases of serial killers who have been caught and ones who have not, I will now explain as briefly as possible both the subjective and objective methodology of psychological or psychiatric profiling and the relevance of its forensic subdivisions. I conduct this preliminary in order to demonstrate that psychological or psychiatric profiling is both a behavioural science and an art, not a haphazard system of mere guesswork or hindsight concocted after the killer has been captured. In addition, I shall introduce personal, empirical innovations to the existing methodology of psychological or psychiatric profiling, integrating them into a central prolific system and then logically extending and dividing functional or organic conclusions into two main categories, namely the psychopathic and the psychotic. The personal modifications and interpretations, combined with a psychological or psychiatric emphasis on pathological patterns of thought and behaviour, will perhaps marginally enhance the future possible quotient of prediction and detection in the pursuit of serial killers. I personally appreciate the study more when the opponent is unorthodox and versatile. Quote, "The chessboard is the world. The pieces are the phenomena of the universe. The rules of the game are what we call the laws of nature. The player on the other side is hidden from us. We know that his play is always fair, just, and patient, but also we know, to our cost, that he never overlooks a mistake or makes the smallest allowance for ignorance." End quote. T.H. Huxley, 1825 to 1895. The player is hidden, but his acts are not, and the primal motivation behind the acts is essentially unoriginal. The crime scene should be studied with a degree of atavism. What has taken place before. What has taken place shall take place again. The answers are within that conviction, that cycle of eternal recurrence. Opportunistic homicide, in the context of the emotive terms good and evil, should be removed from the realms of mysticism. There are basically three types of people: the optimist, who has the naive expectation of universal altruism; the pessimist, who has a morbid conviction of universal malevolence; and finally, the remainder, who exercise a pragmatic, humanistic approach. In which category do you believe you belong? Your answer will, of course, largely be dictated, first by personal vanity, and second, by which category you believe the criminal or serial killer belongs. Now, conjure up the secret urges, images, and fantasies which exist in your own mind, and think again. Pierce Brooks, ex-captain in the Los Angeles Police Department and chief of police in Springfield, Oregon, and Lakewood, Colorado, respectively, had spent over 2 decades formulating and practicing a personal and therefore necessarily limited, form of psychological profiling to help track down and capture serial killers and other violent criminals. In later years, he was to have many conferences with FBI chiefs, particularly members of the Behavioral Science Unit, BSU, at the FBI Training Academy in Quantico, Virginia. As early as 1974, Brooks had also attended conferences at the Justice Department to propose the setting up of a computerized system and task force, which, years later, was to become known as VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. Experts in all fields of national and local law enforcement also attended the conferences and expressed enthusiastic support for the concept. William H. Webster, then director of the FBI, was instructed by the Subcommittee on Juvenile Justice of the Senate Judiciary Committee to examine the VICAP concept, with a view to incorporating it into the administration of the FBI Behavioral Science Unit at the FBI Academy. The subcommittee heard the testimony of innumerable expert witnesses from police agencies nationwide, all enthusiastically in support of setting up the VICAP task force under the control of the FBI BSU and funded by them. It was disclosed to the subcommittee that the FBI BSU in Quantico had already researched and instigated a restricted computerized National Crime Analysis Unit in tandem with a special FBI team researching the concept of psychological profiling. The FBI psychological profilers were already interviewing in depth many serial killers in prisons throughout the country, attempting to ascertain common characteristics and traits they shared. This project remained obscure to the American public until the films Manhunter and Silence of the Lambs appeared. Meanwhile, back in 1984, the Reagan administration finally agreed that the VICAP project would be set up under the auspices of the FBI BSU at Quantico, in conjunction with the psychological profiling unit already in existence there, and that the resulting computerized data would be made available to all national and local law enforcement agencies. The vision, first conceived by Brooks Pierce in prior decades, had at last come into being. Psychology and technology had joined forces and become a formidable weapon to combat all violent criminals, particularly the high-profile threat of the mobile, trawling serial killer. When a definite pattern of killings is detected by state or local police, a team from the FBI Behavioral Science Unit is called in to assist. Their prime task is to study the crime scenes closely and assess whatever forensic evidence has already been collated, then to look for anything that might have been overlooked or not properly interpreted at a local level. It is by tabulating and evaluating the where, when, how and why of the murders that the serial killer's personality print and crime scene signature begin to emerge, and a possible rhythm to the killings detected, perhaps leading to a working hypothesis or subsequent prediction of where and when the killer is likely to strike next. For instance, from the series of in-depth interviews the FBI Behavioral Science Unit conducted with captured serial killers who were sexually motivated, some of the following statistics were tabulated. 1. Almost 90% had received psychiatric treatment at some stage in their life. 2. Over 50% had family members with a psychiatric illness. 3. 35% had at some time attempted to commit suicide. 4. More than 40% had been sexually abused as children, and this figure almost doubled in the instances of psychological abuse as children. 5. 45% had a criminal record at an early age. 6. 75% did not have a steady job. 7. 30% were Caucasian. 8. 44% came from a one-parent family. 9. 70% had a strict mother. 10. 75% had a strict father. 11. 70% had an interest in pornography. These figures and many other additional criminal statistics assisted the behavioral science unit in formulating a table of traits and characteristics which would help to identify a serial killer. But that is not to say, as some authoritarian schools of thought might expediently argue, that a violent criminal or a serial killer can be identified as such by reference to his or her childhood behaviour before an age when a sense of conscience, aesthetics, or idealism has been given a chance to evolve. If that were the case, you might easily confuse the serial killer with a far more aggressive and dangerous future general or politician. However, as can be clearly predicated from the above statistics, if a child is physically or psychologically abused or rejected in early childhood, either by parents or, as the statistics carefully neglect to mention because of the political implications, social deprivation, the chances of him or her reacting violently against authority in later life is dramatically enhanced. As previously stated, I have constructed a table divided into two main categories, the psychopathic and the psychotic. However, this does not mean that the two categories are mutually exclusive. A psychopathic killer may have secondary affective symptoms of psychosis. The psychotic killer may have secondary affective psychopathic symptoms. Further, very occasionally, a schizoid serial killer may emerge who possesses, almost in equal quantity, affective psychopathic and psychotic traits and characteristics. In other more general instances from my experience, the initial murder or murders by either a psychopath or a psychotic invariably takes place in or near the area in which the killer lives or works, as familiarity breeds both desire and self-confidence. Therefore, expert assessment of what can be ascertained to be the killer's first ventures into homicide will produce the most comprehensive personality print or crime scene signature of the serial killer. From study of the crime scene data, one should at least be able to make a tentative estimation as to which main category the killer belongs. Obviously, computerized national records would be exhaustively cross-referenced to establish whether previous crimes bearing the same, or similar, modus operandi had been tabulated in some other part of the country. Tracking back on a national scale to establish and intensively study the forensic evidence of the initial murder by the killer is made no less important by distance. The first strike principle of proximity still applies. The high IQ serial killer is a complex, eclectic individual who is not ruled by mere consistency or routine. He is likely to resort to pragmatic innovations where necessity or intellect dictates. Therefore, this category of killer is so much more difficult to predict or trap by mere pedantic or academic adherence to the textbook. One must be extremely careful never to equate insanity with stupidity. There is often a grandeur in insanity, and an insanity in grandeur. The seed of genius, which I hastened to add I do not claim to possess, can thrive just as robustly in the dark as in the light. The pathological killer, effectively influenced by cyclical factors, axiomatically gives advantage and proactive initiative to the detective. But the killer to whom the universe teaches chaos or absurdity is unlikely to fall victim to an easily recognized pattern or less than sophisticated, proactive strategy by the police. By definition, the very fact that the killer thinks in universal, existential, or cautiously omnipotent terms widens the mindscape in which his acts are likely to be committed. Essentially, belief in either chaos or absurdity creates the same vision of man. An ant trying to fathom the mysteries of the cosmos and dismally failing. Therefore, the acts of such a killer will probably be as much a product of intellect as of passion, far harder to comprehend or predict. If he conceives murder as art, he will naturally perceive his acts as spontaneous creative destruction, and therefore he himself possibly has no idea where or when his next brushstroke shall fall, or whether the results will be aesthetically pleasing. If not pleasing, he will not repeat the hue. How then can the detective anticipate in such a case? If the killer is so consciously mindful of effect, his subconscious will nevertheless leave identifiable psychological traces, personality traits, and characteristics. The more complex the creation, the more information his subconscious shall reveal. His paintings will become identifiable primarily by their brushstrokes, rather than the subject matter. There will doubtless be killers aware of this trace element, who will attempt to create diversions, in much the same manner as some people can appear to converse a great deal about themselves as a method of concealing their true nature. However, all in all, despite such precautionary tactics, the subconscious will nevertheless reveal more than the serial killer consciously wishes. Even silence reveals evidence by omission. The worst possible scenario for the detective would be a killer educated in the employment of auto-hypnotic techniques, which would enable him to modify and program his subconscious to a controlled, effective degree, like a chameleon, capable of consciously altering the colour of his personality at root level. This concept is not simply theoretical. I, myself, used it successfully. The practical mechanics of examining and analysing the crime scene presented by any serial killer naturally requires insight as well as deductive skills. The most important answers are already within the psyche of the investigator, within us all, in my opinion. The serial killer is, in effect, your alter ego, that facet of your character you strive so hard to conceal and repress. You study serial killers, not only to understand him or her, but also yourselves. Like any other individual, the serial killer doesn't wish anyone to know something until he is ready to reveal it himself. The collating of crime scene information with whatever other factual, physical, and circumstantial evidence routine police work has managed to come up with also requires expertise, the prime object being to build a psychological portrait of the type of killer who would commit a particular type of murder. his probable pathology and motivation, and, by tried and tested principles, to attempt to chart and predict the possible course, cyclical parameters, choice of environment, type of victim, and general methodology his next crime is likely to include. In short, his crime signature. In reality, the investigator is asking why he himself would commit that particular kind of murder. Ideally, the detective should always assess the killer in both psychological and philosophical or metaphysical terms, in order to determine what the killer believes in, or what he believes he is accomplishing or aspiring to accomplish by his crimes. We can safely predict that the serial killer has confronted the chaos or absurdity of existence, as previously mentioned, the spiritual abyss, whether it be religious or secular in nature, and is trying to impose upon it some meaning and order of his own. Although there have been serial killers whose crimes were motivated by orthodox religious fanaticism or visions, in my experience, they are a small minority. But there are killers who, not believing in any orthodox god, create one of their own, or, more accurately, who believe in a form of personal philosophy, predominantly nihilistic in character, so devoutly that it has the psychological power of a religion. This category, in my opinion, constitutes the majority of serial killers. Seeing no divine order of things, no hidden significance to life, other than the hedonistic or existential, they create their own spiritual or aesthetic microcosm, metaphorically gods in their own kingdom, whimsically sampling everything that was once forbidden, eventually taking the lives of those who have entered their private domain, witnessed their darkest desires, and therefore must never be allowed to leave or testify. The killing also affirmatively defines their new powers. That is why, in this primarily metaphysical context, some can often regard destruction as an act of creation, an act of God. Man created God in his own image, then claimed that God created him in his. The serial killer juggles dreams and fantasies in similar fashion. He is impatiently withering under the confinements of what is generally accepted as ordinary reality. Most people are. He daily observes people throwing their entire lives away on repetitive jobs, territorial obsessions, promotion to a particular desk, key to the executive toilet, etc. To his eyes, this is insanity. He craves excitement, vibrant meaning, purpose, but it never seems to come. He cannot wait indefinitely. Life has become a funeral cortege. Indifference and ubiquitous mediocrity provoke him. He appoints himself possessor, enlightened inhabitant of a vacant universe, a cynical Don Quixote, tilting at any laws and customs, questioning his newfound sense of nihilistic integrity. Time has been squandered. Time to catch up. A hidden agenda to foster. Personal accounts to settle. Dormant fantasies to fulfill. He thirsts for the realm of total possibility. Where should he draw the line? Unconditionally and spontaneously far beyond any borders which others have had the arrogance to draw for him. Ideally, he must perform the dualistic feat of proving to himself that he is literally capable of anything, whilst knowing he is not. Dream as reality, life a work of art, the attempt all. He has a vivid sense of seeing farther and deeper than most. Other people seem to be somnambulistic. He resolves not to be dragged down by numbers. Endurance of others must cease. slough off the last vestiges of servility, vigorous with resentful intent, as though an inner generator, hidden deep within since birth, has been switched on. His spirit expands to encompass the vaster gestalt. Most people have vague intimations of this recondite power. Standing on a vacant shore, staring over oceanic plains, the soothing urge of the void fills them with renewed life. Unknown presences whisper. Arcane meanings beyond language are experienced. Silent music. Some may interpret the metaphysical revitalization as a religious experience, others as a pagan power source, causing them to laugh and dance with savage delight at the cosmic insignificance of humanity. The nature of unconditional freedom is instinctively seized and wielded. And there you have an amorphous soul or psyche portrait of the unknown serial killer. Designer chaos and idiosyncratic subversion. To him, morality reduces life more than it enhances. It could be impartially argued that he inhabits an almost poetic fourth dimension, where dreams and reality naturally meld. A world of esoteric certitude and applied will. A psychic state in which common reality is seen merely as a lace curtain, visually recognized and noted, but too insignificant to interfere with the more fascinating visions he sees beyond. He intuits that those around him can only see the lace curtain, and he keenly appreciates his advantage. While they blankly daydream behind the lace, he acts, the natural prize due to psychic penetration and a superior altered state. It amuses him that conformists, whom he regards as sanctimonious timid bores, preach morality, remaining unaware of his own. Once the victim has been chosen and action commences, the serial killer enters into an abnormal dimension, one in which he is viewing the world as a dynamic scenario, a theatrical event or happening in which he is the prime mover, both artistic creator and sole spectator of a production yet to be viewed by the general public. At another level, the play is an independent production, taking on a life of its own, a hazardous, cathartic drama in which the script is impromptu. Neither the killer nor the victim knows for certain how it will end, nor whether a member of the unseen audience, the public, will decide to participate or not. The passing world has become much like television with the sound turned off, only half intrusive. As already stated, he believes no act in itself has inherent qualities of good or evil that is not made so by an audience. Does a falling tree make a sound if there is no one there to listen? The audience is the value and quality of the act. During the process of artistic creation in the killer's psychic dimension beyond good and evil, the audience is merely a possible off-stage threat. If his play is a success, he will read the critical reviews with interest, not least as a technician in search of dangerous structural flaws. Some people may interpret these expressed multidimensional qualities of the serial killer as denoting the supernatural, others the inhuman. Public fear of the species is ambivalent. On one hand, the atavistic dread of the abnormal is deliberately magnified in the public mind by the mass media. On the other, the astounding popularity of news, books, and films on the subject indicates that the public must thoroughly enjoy being shocked, terrified, and sickened. In fact, the popular current demand for extravaganzas of innocent blood is obviously outstripping supply. It is human nature to derive comfort in the misery of others, and the nature of those in the media to derive maximum profit from it. Some serial killers are obviously intent upon a more equal distribution of misery. Therefore, if the concept of even-handed justice were paramount in the killer's mind, it is surprising that so few victims have been selected from the media milieu who exploit and profit from gore. This curious neglect appears to indicate that the serial killer regards the media as his confederate in crime, his boswell, as it were. Logic confirms there is no such gulf between the instincts of the serial killer and those of the media and public. A common bond of interest and satisfaction exists, the critical variant being, as in the theatre, between those who watch and those who act. Yet thoughts of murder are obviously psychologically and atavistically satisfying to the individual. If only they had the inclination and time to spare, they too would be capable of murder, and certainly would have no shortage of suitable candidates in mind. Indeed, they would feel silently insulted if anyone suggested the contrary. Unlike the serial killer, few feel compelled to prove the point. But murder nevertheless remains probably the most popular primal form of public entertainment there is or ever shall be. Which perhaps helps one to understand why official statistics in practically every civilized country show that you are 99% more likely to be murdered by the person sitting next to you at home this very moment than by a serial killer. A revealing fact I will expand upon shortly. Quote, "One may indeed lie with the mouth, but with the accompanying grimace, one nevertheless tells the truth." End quote. Nietzsche. On this further advanced plateau of mutual understanding, let us now examine some of the basic psychological guidelines for trying to outwit and track down the serial killer in his chosen field of recreation or retribution. I have no compunctions, no sense of betrayed fellowship or breach of loyalty in assisting the opposition, so to speak. After all, the killer knows the risks and is prepared to take them. He has the initiative and should keep abreast or ahead of current forensic developments and other scientific advances. If he makes a miscalculation, he must accept the penalty, but not necessarily the judgment of others. A Christian ethic, of course, put to pagan use. First, there now follows an initial reference table of characteristics and traits which help to identify the psychopathic serial killer. When we get down to individual case histories, this and subsequent tabulations will facilitate speedier understanding of significant factors. A surer grasp of these multiple associations will also assist in understanding the means by which a psychological or psychiatric profile of the killer being hunted is constructed. Bear in mind, the more you tell someone, the more dangerous they become to you, and, therefore, the far more dangerous you become to them.
Psychopath personality print. 1. Organised, emotionally controlled and methodical. 2. Of average or above average intelligence. 3. On the surface, socially competent, persuasive and manipulative. 4. Usually a skilled worker or self-employed. 5. Sexually adequate, heterosexual, homosexual or bisexual. 6. Often an only child. 7. The father or mother usually erratic, irrational, or unstable at work and at home. 8. Subject to inconstant or capricious discipline as a child, and used to getting his or her own way,
The same selfish and amoral attitude extends into adult life. 9. Emotionless, controlled mood when committing a crime. 10. Moderate use of alcohol before or after a crime if stress builds up. 11. Usually married, divorced, or living with a partner. 12. Owns or uses a reliable, functional vehicle. 13. Liable to change jobs quite often and move from one area or town or city to another. No sense of social awareness or community. 14. Takes an interest in media reports about his crimes, especially news of police tactics being adopted. 15. By creating a fantasy, sexual or otherwise, and putting it into action, he believes he creates his own highly controlled existential reality, his personal microcosm. 16. He is likely to return to the scene of the crime either to recreate the crime in imagination or to check whether the crime scene has been discovered or disturbed or holds some originally overlooked clue or danger. 17. He will usually personalize the victim, talk to them to give added significance, emotional and intellectual depth to the crime. Unlike the psychotic, he has little to fear from his conscience by personalization of the victim. Psychopathic factors at scene of crime. A. Indications that the crime was carefully planned and organized. B. Initial victim probably chosen in a district in or near where the killer lives or lived, works or worked, or is or was otherwise highly familiar with. He will probably correct this mistake when he sees the police in his home ground and strike next in a more distant area. The initial victim may ostensibly be a stranger, but is more likely to be someone he knows, even if only by sight. He may initially kill the victim, not as part of his fantasy, but simply to avoid leaving a witness who could give a description of him to the police. When he is killed once, it will be easier the second time, and killing will probably gradually become either 1. An habitual self-protective measure, a compulsive part of his modus operandi, or 2. A metaphysical or psychological experience he has grown to appreciate. C. He deliberately personalizes and terrorizes the victim either to gain easier control, experience a further dimension of power, add emotional depth, or obtain sadistic satisfaction from their fear. The more insecure he is, the more likely a weapon will be brandished. Talks to them in an abstract, controlled manner, issuing threats or describing their probable fate if they don't comply with everything he says. Conversely, he may falsely reassure them by promising they will come to no harm so long as they keep quiet and do as he tells them. This may be done for expediency or as a sophisticated form of sadism in the knowledge he is going to kill the victim anyway. Sadomasochistically, he is deriving pleasure from what he knows the victim is experiencing. Fear, shame, hope, despair, wishing an end to the experience, hope to live, a surrendering to deliberate sexual stimulation against their will, and experiencing pleasure without guilt. D. Above all, he wants total submission from the victim. E. If insecure, he is likely to use restraints, handcuffs, rope, gag, etc. F. Obtains his satisfaction by rape or other violence prior to death of victim. Despite appearances, the central motivation is power, not sex. Sex and violence are both expressions of his will to power.
He may wish to dominate and control his victim totally as part of his fantasy. This compulsion also indicates deep feelings of insecurity. G. Takes methodical pains to leave no forensic clues at the crime scene. Will hide or bury the body to minimize risk. No body, no crime. H. Rarely leaves a weapon behind. Will normally destroy or dispose of it in a river, etc., usually some distance from the crime scene. If he keeps the weapon, it is likely to be for some obsessive, ritualistic reason. I. He will probably take a trophy from the victim, a ring, garment, lock of hair, etc., for use as a catalyst to reenact and savour the memory of the crime. This reenactment also serves to satisfy him psychologically, extending his cooling-off period between murders. J. A vehicle will be used to convey the live victim or the body to the disposal area. K. Contrary to popular detective fiction, if the killer is of average or above average intelligence, it is highly improbable that he will risk keeping any press cuttings about his crimes. Trophies are likely to be hidden in an obscure, secure place, such as a safe deposit box, second address, a lock-up garage, etc. There are psychological or psychiatric subdivisions and secondary symptoms in every broad category profile. These shall be considered further on. Let us first tabulate the traits and characteristics of the second broad category. Psychotic personality print. 1. Volatile, spontaneous and disorganized. Usually seriously maladjusted, emotionally and intellectually. May experience hallucinations, reacting chiefly to inner experiences rather than external, perceiving a delusionary concept of reality. Often suffers from cycles of manic depression or profound melancholia. 2. Can be below or above average intelligence, depending upon the effective degree and subdivisions of psychosis involved, but in certain cases can soar to well above average. 3. Normally prefers unskilled work. 4. Sometimes sexually inadequate by normal standards, but stimulated by abnormal fantasy, can be sexually rapacious and violent. 5. Father socially erratic or incompetent. Son tends to emulate the father. 6. Probably experienced harsh parental discipline or psychological or sexual abuse. 7. Suffers from stress or emotional anxiety during crime. 8. Rarely uses alcohol during crime. 9. Usually lives alone. 10. Dramatic fluctuations in behaviour. 11. Normally lives or works in the area in which his initial crimes were committed. 12. Takes no real interest in media reports of his crimes or police tactics. 13. Usually neither owns nor uses a vehicle. Commits his crimes opportunistically or spontaneously in whatever spot or area he happens to be. 14. Being unable to square his personal perceptions and conceptions with surrounding reality, he consciously and subconsciously erects protective mental blocks and creates his own distorted version of reality, one which fits the ideal image he has of himself and the personal microcosm he inhabits. 15. Usually depersonalizes the victim by deliberately perceiving him or her as an object, attempting to eradicate any twinge of conscience which he almost certainly regards as a sign of weakness. 16. Extreme character polarizations, may hold religious beliefs but reconciles them with criminal acts he commits. Psychotic factors at the scene of a crime. A. As the disorganized psychotic usually kills erratically within a window of opportunity, hastily innovating as events dictate, the scene of the crime reflects general disorder and should furnish important clues to the profiler. B. He will usually not even bother to conceal the victim, or, at best, do so in a cursory, sloppy manner, either 1. Because he simply does not care about the victim, or 2. Does not fully appreciate the consequences of his act and the increased risks involved, or 3. Wishes to further degrade the victim by discarding them naked to public view or to shock those who discover the body. C. Despite the fact that he normally knows one or more of his initial victims and lives or works in the same vicinity, he is usually not aware of the obvious dangers inherent in killing a victim in his home territory. This will depend upon the degree of mental maladjustment involved and the strength of effective influence exerted by the subdivisions of his psychosis. Therefore, unlike the psychopath, he will be tardier in strategically selecting other districts in which to strike. This is an important point to note, as it leads to faster psychological classification of the killer, denoting whether he is predominantly psychopathic or psychotic, and often strongly suggests the probable direction in which to concentrate the search for his base of operations, and the detection of a probable pattern revealing where and when he is likely to kill next. D. Rarely uses restraints on victim. E. There will usually be pathological, ritualistic, or some esoteric factors at the crime scene, which will reflect aspects of the killer's fantasy fulfillment, his psychosis, and perhaps some of its subdivisions and secondary symptoms. F. Where the organized psychopath nearly always chooses isolated or secure areas in which to kill or take his victims to, the psychotic will often kill in places fraught with obvious dangers: streets, busy parks, subways, and other public venues. The nature of his psychosis often generates a total or partly effective delusion that he is being protected or aided by supernatural forces of some description. That completes the initial basic tabulations, which help to identify into which of the two broad categories, psychopathic or psychotic, the hunted serial killer fits, and some of the further significant indications which have to be looked for at the crime scene. The next required step in building a comprehensive psychological or psychiatric profile of the particular killer being sought is a precise evaluation of his modus operandi from start to finish. This is naturally achieved by an exhaustive survey of each crime scene, compiling a highly individualistic personality print or crime signature from the conscious or subconscious methodology he employs throughout. Evidence of symbolism, ritualistic or sadistic fantasy is of special relevance. We are, as previously evidenced, searching for and creating, from explicit and implicit evidence, a physical and psychological afterimage of the killer. Modifications may be required as investigations progress or further murders are committed, providing additional data to test against the original hypothesis. In the process of constructing a psychological or psychiatric profile under one or other of the two main categories, psychopathic and psychotic, evidence of secondary symptoms and additional subclassifications of abnormality assist in determining the nature of the fantasy the killer is acting out. In the case of psychotics, some category of schizophrenia is usually present: simple, acute, hebephrenic, paranoid, etc. Every variety of psychosis should be considered: organic, functional, hallucinatory, delusional, melancholic, general paresis, alcoholic reactions, pathological intoxication, acute alcoholic hallucinosis, Korsakoff's syndrome, senile dementia, psychotic depression, involutional melancholia, the male climacteric, manic depressive psychosis, psychotic mania, hypnomania, etc. Some of these symptoms may also be found in the psychopath to a non-effective degree. Thus, we axiomatically enter the field of compulsions, obsessions, phobias, dissociated personalities, fugues, traumatic neuroses, multiple personality, psychosexual behavior, sexual symbolism, sexual aberrations, and resort to all the main schools of psychology: structuralist, psychophysical, functionalist, psychoanalytic, gestalt, behavioralist, or behavioral, in the context of psychological profiling, the most important. Some individuals erroneously believe that if they master logic, they will master life. Logic is merely a tool, the science of argument. In that context, it can be used to deduce what argument the serial killer is trying to put across by his actions, what he is trying to prove or disprove. A syllogism presents two parts of an argument, in which the premises may be stated before the conclusion. Therefore, the serial killer's successive murders can logically be developed as the premises from which one must synthesize conclusions that may lead to his capture. Even though most serial killers are not guided by logic, his pursuers are constrained to be. Logic plus inspired insight is a much greater threat to the quarry, no matter how ultra-modern technological research is likely to become. As stated, much valuable information can be amassed from extended interviews with serial killers, though obviously a great deal depends on how proficient the psychiatrist or interviewer is, or how forthcoming the killer. One must understand that there is little intellectual or spiritual inducement for the captured serial killer to cooperate in any way. To all intents and purposes, his real life is over and done with, as he knows he shall never be free again, so why should he volunteer information or reveal aspects of his personality to the authorities? Most killers will be intelligent enough to realize that the penal authorities will mainly use such information as control points against him. Therefore, he is most likely to reveal only that information which may persuade the authorities to understand his better side and treat him more humanely. Naturally, prior to interviewing, all aspects of the serial killer's case must be exhaustively studied: family and educational background, pathology reports on victims, police interviews, trial transcripts, how he spends his time in prison, what he reads, other hobbies, brand of cigarettes if a smoker, favourite chocolate bar, relationship with guards and prisoners, observed general attitude to his crimes, etc. Essentially, you will read him by his actions. Avoid use of questionnaires and an overtly structural approach. Much more will be revealed obliquely in relaxed, free-flowing conversation, touching upon politics, general philosophy, topical social questions, authors, films, controversial personalities, universal moral dilemmas. The aim is to generate, as far as possible in the artificial circumstances of captivity, the sort of spontaneous atmosphere and genial conversation of a bar, avoiding the self-consciousness of formality. Do not make instant notes. Create interest and it will snowball. That's the time to be a good, observant listener. One careless display of fisheye or impatient disinterest by the interviewer can destroy the whole relaxed ambience. Therefore, eyes must be constantly candid and receptive, ready for the unexpected dart of eye contact. All these and additional techniques should be second nature to a seasoned interviewer. Many of these very same techniques are also used by serial killers to lull and snare victims. The interviewer will, in effect, be faced with the difficult task of deceiving a skillful deceiver. The serial killer shares, to a significant degree, a common characteristic of the schizoid, namely, a marked lack of tension in reconciling polarized opinions or beliefs. This relativistic dexterity is an advantageous aid both to deception and self-deception, the latter enhancing the persuasion of the former. The higher the vocabulary and ability to articulate with apparent validity, the more convincing the argument, independent of truth, as every lawyer and expert logician knows. In short, expressed even more cynically, it is the impression that counts, both in the eliciting and delivery of information. Personal interaction and observation will indicate the best psychological method to mine information from an adversary, and the information will instinctively form the basis of the most effective structure of persuasion to be adopted. Negative or positive responses, semantical nuances, body language, etc., all reflect or infer significant covert data for hypothesis, reapplication, and ever-discreet testing, never underestimating the opponent's own powers of observation and interpretation. As previously betokened, one careless word or gesture, a solitary false note, can damage or neutralize a painstakingly nurtured ambience beyond recall. It is, therefore, largely safer to maintain a cautiously interested, confidential tone of underemphasis, unless otherwise is specifically or tactically indicated. The inner gyroscope of counter-transference is usually accurate and reliable. You will note that I have kept this in general terms, as opposed to that of interrogating a serial killer exclusively. By and large, the serial killer, like the socially sanctioned killer, regards himself as normal, except to the extent that he has transformed thought or fantasy into action. Naturally, an attitude indicating you regard him as an alien species will achieve naught except his regarding you similarly. In fact, even without given cause, the serial killer will, at inception, regard the interviewer as hostile anyway, by force of adversarial circumstance, and this dualistic defense mechanism is something the interviewer has to overcome. Personally, I could or can evaluate the integrity and caliber of a psychiatrist usually within the first 10 minutes of a discussion, and decide whether to persevere or dismiss him or her as mechanistic. Ironically, in some instances, the psychiatrist himself evinces a serious personality disorder, so it should not be surprising that, according to official statistics, psychiatrists as a group have the highest suicide rate. Obviously a schizoid hazard of the profession, perhaps mainly due to patients injecting persuasive relativistic philosophy into the field of inevitably limited psychodiagnostics and upsetting professional mental equilibrium. A structurally impaired professional ego can quite easily be forced from its complacent tracks by psychodynamic intuition expressed in forcefully emotive and impulsive terms. the spoken word can possess a psychic penetration far beyond the reason of the written, as exemplified by the hypnotic oratory of Adolf Hitler and other great manipulators of primal emotion whose vocal delivery takes on the mystical power and the sway of music, a psychosemantic symphony. Quote, "Then the thing of courage as roused with rage doth sympathize, and with an accent tuned in self-same key retorts to chiding fortune." End quote. Troilus and Cressida, Shakespeare. In the following pages, I shall not tax the reader's patience with abstruse medical terminology without defining clearly in plain language what is meant. As the prime purpose of this book is a study of the forensic evidence relevant to compiling a psychological profile of the killer, I shall not unduly clutter these pages with the name and biography of every victim of each killer, unless the killer is targeting a certain category of victim. Other authors most often do use such victim biographical material, but in many instances simply as humanistic or artistic padding. In this particular case, it would only serve to distract from the prime object. This volume is not intended to be a psychological or psychiatric textbook. If further constrained to classify the book's contents and intent, I am forced to resort to sporting terms. It is a modest manual for helping to track and capture the greatest and most dangerous animal in existence, the human predator. I am understandably aware that tabulated techniques of the hunt may unavoidably assist the hunted as well as the hunter. Therefore, both would do well to remember, quote, "He who fights with monsters might take care lest he thereby become a monster, and if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you." End quote. Nietzsche. End of chapter 7. End of part 1.